You know, it's kind of funny when the new secretary came in at the beginning of the administration. He kind of limited telework for people because people had to be in their offices and ready to meet people when they came in the door. And I joke, we serve an 8-state region. I have no one that comes in our door to talk to us face to face. So I'm used to working on things remotely with people around. So this whole online, the only thing it's done for me is it's limited my travel. I think I've been stuck for the most that I've ever without traveling. So thank you for having me. It's fun to give a presentation. A little bit more of a background. I'm originally an Iowan. So it's nice to be back in the state. Been here just over 4 years now with the Midwest Climate Hub. Lenore mentioned that I was in the state climatologist for South Dakota and also on faculty at South Dakota State, where I spent 13 years. So everything I do and talk about is through the lens of trying to make use of weather and climate information and putting it in the ability for people to be able to use that. You know, it's trying to develop new uses, doing additional research about climate and ag issues, and then how do we make use of it? Because that's one of the things that is really very important to me, and you'll catch that flavor as we go along here. I am married, have 4 kids, 3 of whom have gone through Iowa State, so they're helping pay you guys salary, something like that. So anyway, the 4th one just didn't go here because you guys don't have the major that he had. So it is nice to be back on campus, and I do enjoy interacting with the people at the university. The other thing is, the bad about this being online is I would like this to be a much more interactive seminar. I don't want to be talking at you for 50 minutes. I don't like doing that. You probably don't want to hear me do that because I don't think I'll have anything new and astounding that you're going to walk away from going, oh, cool, here's what Todey said. No, I would like to give you a flavor for what we are, what we're trying to do, and to try to develop relationships with what you folks are doing to be able to make better use, or help to maybe guide some research you're doing to things that we need to know, and help to make better use of that information in trying to connect with our stakeholders. And I'll talk about who our stakeholders here are in a little bit. That is our role that is in the hub. So I want to be able to talk more, hear from you, what your questions and thoughts are as we go along, and help to develop some new relationships as we go along through this. I know that there's climate change work going on in the department. From looking at what I saw from people on the list of people, and that's really cool. So hopefully we continue to make additional use out of that. So let's see if I can get my slides up here, and all right. And one more click. Okay, while I'm doing this, by a raise of hands, how many people have heard of the Midwest Climate Hub? I'm seeing some hands raised, so that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Let's see if we can stretch this out here and try to act like I really know what I'm doing here. So that's good that some of you have heard of us, and for those of you who haven't, I'll give you a flavor about who we are. And I say we in a collective sense right now. I guess that's the other thing too, is if you have a question or comment along the way, just go ahead and interrupt me. I'm used to doing a lot of outreach, extension kind of activities. So I'm happy with people interrupting to argue with me and anywhere along the way. So, or if you want to raise your hand, or I want to try to see if I can get the chat up here. Where's the chat? So that, okay, we can have the chat window up here too and available. I say we in a collective sense in that there's not much we here right now. When I came here to the hub, I took over for Jerry Hatfield. Most of you have probably heard of Jerry Hatfield. He has since retired. Even though he was no longer the director, we were making use of some of his research and what we were doing. There's also a coordinator Our coordinator recently left to go back to NOAA in Alaska up in Anchorage, so we're in process of trying to get that position filled. And we also had a postdoc fellow who also led some of our research efforts we'll talk about as we go along. We've lost that position and working to try to get funding for that position back. So the collective Midwest Climate Hub you're looking at right now. So that's why it's important for us to try to develop partnerships more and more as we go along here. Okay. Give you a little more background about the hubs, and then we'll talk about some of the disease, the climate interactions, and then at the end we'll give you some where to find more information, contact information, that sort of thing. Okay. Again, I kind of mentioned about the background of the hubs. The hubs are now 6.5 years old. They were started in 2014. Originally, they were envisioned as all about climate change. Since that time, they've allowed us to broaden our mission a little bit more related to a wide variety of climate issues. We dabble in a number of different things. We even dabble in pesticide drift. We won't get into that too much today unless you want to, because there is a weather interaction with that. And I make use of that because of some connections I've had over time. There are 10 hubs nationally. The map here gives you the breakdown of where they are. We cover officially an 8-state region, which is Minnesota over to Missouri, and then Michigan to Ohio. Basically, most of the Eastern Corn Belt. Because of my connections in South Dakota, we kind of lop over and do some things over in the Northern Plains Hub. And we also can kind of connect Kentucky. It's odd because if you look at the ARS Midwest region, it's our 8-state region plus Kentucky. For some reason, when they made the climate hubs, they didn't put Kentucky in our region. I don't know why, but we connect there. We share our region. I guess I should also say, of the 10 hubs, 5 are housed in ARS and 5 are housed in the Forest Service. Basically because of the more predominant agriculture-related issues in those regions. We share our region with what's called the Northern Forest Hub out of Houghton, Michigan. They are housed in the Forest Service and they cover basically the forestry issues in our area. So we allow them to take care of that, and we cover the rest of agriculture. Northern Forest Hub also covers the Northeast. And then, you know, the 10, California is its own hub, and then Puerto Rico and the Caribbean islands are also their own hub. Work we generally do is broken down roughly into 3 areas: assessments and syntheses, you know, delivering relevant information, outreach and education, how we help people make use of that information, and then technical support. How do we provide information again for people to use, that sort of thing. We'll talk about more of these here in just a little bit. Also, to connect this, we partner very closely. We mentioned ARS and the Forest Service. NRCS is a very strong partner of ours. Other parts of USDA do connect with us to varying levels. So we do work with all of USDA, and they are part of our stakeholder group. Vision and mission, basically trying to help deliver information for producers to adapt to and be resilient under climate change is the basic premise of what we do within the Midwest Climate Hub. Again, we work with partners, all of USDA, but also other federal partners, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NIDIS with drought-related issues, state climatologists, and then land grants. Land grants, all of the land grants in our region are very strong partners of ours. And I'll explain kind of the role that we work with those. We have very strong connections with Extension, also trying to develop connections with the experiment stations as we go along. Okay, some relevant things about what we do in our areas. Our assessments and syntheses, kinds of things that we do is some of research. I participate some in research. Our postdoc fellow, which I'll talk more about her work as we're going along here, did more work on invasives in our region, insects, weeds, and their climate components. She worked with Jerry Hatfield on those, produced some really good information. We'll talk more about those. We do publish. We were part of the last National Climate Assessment. I'll talk more about the National Climate Assessment a little bit later. A lot of the things that you're seeing today, we'll see today, have come from the National Climate Assessment and our contribution to that. Some of the outreach and education kinds of things we do. I do a lot of talks because there is demand across the region for this kind of information. As you may know, ISU does not have an extension climate person at this point. So I'm helping fill that role also along with Justin Glisson, our state climatologist down at the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, trying to fill that role until the university hopefully will be able to refill that position. I know some of you have worked formerly with Elwyn Taylor, and Elwyn was on my committee, so we had some strong connections. And so I fill in a lot on some of the extension kind of work related to that. But then we also work regionally. One of the big ways is called the Midwest Agriculture and Climate Team. Basically, we connect with extension all across our 8-state region to share information about current conditions. And we meet at least once a month to talk about the current situations and look at potential future issues. We actually developed this through a situation back in 2017 where we had early dormancy break because of a warm late winter in the eastern corn belt, and we had fruit trees and other perennials that were starting to break dormancy well ahead of our last freeze, our last spring freeze. So we started meeting with extension folks in those areas to talk about issues and to share information. And that has now grown to extension over our, well, 8-state plus. We have partners in some of the additional states who connect with us also. And then we supply also some technical support, information, talks, and those other sorts of things. So we work on all crops as much as we possibly can. Obviously, corn and soybeans are huge in our region, but there are large numbers of other specialty crops that don't get as much servicing of information because of their smaller scale area or more isolated, the more isolated growing areas or types of crops. But many of these crops are even more weather sensitive, climate sensitive than corn and beans are. And they don't have quite sometimes the crop insurance background that they do, that the main row crops do. So we try to help deliver information for them as much as possible. You know, some of the big area, the ones that we have, cranberries, pumpkins in Illinois, a variety of different crops around the region that we interact with as much as possible and try to develop information for them whenever we possibly can. And here's some, just an example of the acreage of those. Iowa doesn't have as many acres, but you go to especially to our north and east, those Great Lakes areas, there are large areas of specialty crops that are grown in. So let me pause here. Are there any questions that anybody has at this point? Other comments or questions?
Dennis, I have a question. So you are the director of the Midwest Hub, and you're located here in Ames. Do the other states in this region have someone who's kind of provides data or that you interact with in the other states?
Yeah, it depends on who that is in the state. Most states have a state climatologist who does interact with agriculture. So we work with them. Some states, in addition to having a state climatologist, have another presence in extension, for example. So we interact with them because they usually communicate with each other. Indiana, for example, has a relatively new state climatologist, but they have 2 people within extension who have climate and ag backgrounds. So we work and communicate with them closely. It depends, it just depends on whatever's, whoever the people are and whatever they're doing in that state is who I interact with. So we try to build those partnerships wherever possible. Okay. Other questions? You can chime up or you can type them in the chat. I've got finally got the chat appearing here, so. Okay, we'll go ahead and go on with talking about some of the other more juicier issues, so to speak. You know, the title of the comment, the title of the seminar was more than just temperature and precipitation, because those are the two that often get most talked about in the way of what's happening in the way of climate change. But and so we will talk about them a little bit to regionalize some of the issues that we're dealing with, but they are producing a wide range of different issues, some of which we know about, some of which we still are discovering, and some of which are kind of esoteric, that we have individual people working in that area that we could make use of their information. For an example, I was visiting Ohio State. I tried to hit all the land grants. I was talking at Ohio State, and one of their administrators, I think, worked with some nematode, and she was talking about how this nematode was progressing northward gradually because its limitation was by frozen soils. Because of that, we were seeing northward progression of this that otherwise would have limited because of changes that we're seeing in wintertime precipitation. So there's all kinds of these interesting little different pieces that we can talk about. Sometimes we just have to search for them and find the right kind of people that we're dealing with. So there's lots of climate information sorts of issues for agriculture. You know, changing in temperature and precipitation, changing fieldwork times, various disease, insect, weed pressures. Some of you are familiar with these. We'll talk more about some of those as we go along. Seemingly more extremes. The extremes are a bit difficult, and extremes and variability are a bit difficult to talk about because they're a little bit hard to measure. Because when you start talking about extremes and variability, you're talking, especially in the way of variability, various scales of temporal and spatial variability. So when you start trying to put those two together, it's hard to talk about those over long periods of time to be able to say, here's what's happening in the way of variability. You can do that relatively easily at points, but when you try to bring different spatial scales to it, it does confuse the issue. So it's hard to get at that idea of increasing variability. There does seem to be that issue that we are dealing with more extreme kinds of things from one year to the next, or even within a year, that is adding to a number of these other types of issues that we're seeing. So just a quick background on those couple other issues we talked about. Temperature changes, when we're talking about climate change, global warming, we are getting warmer. In the graphic in the upper right-hand side, as I mentioned from the National Climate Assessment, annually, we are getting warmer. This is changes since the beginning of the 20th century. The redder the area is the more the warming is. So generally, northern and western parts of the U.S. are warming the most, while the southern part of the U.S. is warming less when you're talking about annual temperatures. But there are more details in that when we talk about temperature changes. One, in that winters are warming faster than the other seasons are. So that has a different impact on issues related to insects, disease, overwintering of insects. We'll talk more about as we go along here. It also has issues related to soils. How long are soils frozen? And soils are frozen less, and some of those variability issues. Interestingly enough, summer temperatures, if you look on the lower right-hand side of this, summer temperatures are not warming quite as much. We'll talk more about that here in just a second. So related to this, you know, warmer temperatures, especially with warmer minimum temperatures without air conditioning, you add to human stress, livestock stress, pushes additional growing degree days accumulation of for crops and also for insects. So there are various issues related to that. And it does also increase our frost-free period. Our growing season is actually getting longer. We'll talk more about that here in a bit, but we are getting a longer growing season. That summertime temperature that I talked about, though, is really interesting because there's a difference in what's happening in the summertime temperatures. This is a graphic for Iowa, and the lines or the dots are each summer plus. I'm doing May through August here, so a good chunk of the growing season. And then the years are 1895 on the left and 20, don't know if we got 2020 in on this yet or not. So all the years between 1895 and the present. And the upper left-hand side is average high temperatures for those years. And on the lower right-hand side is the average low temperatures for those years. So doesn't take a master's degree in statistics to see we have something largely different happening in our high temperatures and low temperatures. Basically, our minimums are flat to our maximums are flat to decreasing. Our warm years are not nearly as warm as some of the previous years we had in the early part of the century, especially the 1930s, but more frequently we are seeing very warm nights. So we're decreasing our daytime temperature range, and then adding additional degree days, but that also adds to the disease issues that we'll talk more about that as we go along here. In addition, we are getting wetter, and probably when we're looking at the upper Midwest, this one is probably even bigger than the temperature one in the way of precipitation. I know when we go out and talk to producers and we talk about climate change carefully, not because we're trying to avoid it, but we're trying to avoid turning off some people to introduce that issue sometimes. So we'll try to get them to bring up the issue and ask them if you see things changing. And some version of wetness comes, usually is one of the first things brought up. So this is showing what's happening to annual precipitation. Again, since the beginning of the 20th century. The darker green, and this is also from the National Climate Assessment, the darker greens are biggest increases in precipitation by more than 15%. The areas that are brown are seeing decreases in precipitation. So you can see all the upper Midwest is getting wetter in some form. Iowa and parts of the Northern Plains actually are some of the wettest, the biggest increases in that. I'd like to point out, how many of you have been to Arizona? And if you like going to Arizona, how many people have moved to Arizona in the last, 50 years or whatever? And basically talking about how we're worsening our situation in the desert Southwest, because we have a place where we have not much water. It's actually getting drier. Even Southern California fits in there, and we're putting more people in that area. So we're creating a drought situation, a water drought, because there's just not enough water to go around. But want to talk about in our region what's happening on a seasonal basis. Most of the seasons in our region are getting wetter. Spring is probably the biggest issue that we talk about in the way of agriculture, producers being able to get out and put things in the ground, going into wet soils, products being put into wet soils, and the disease issues related to that. So this is a background from a disease standpoint, a pathology standpoint. I'm not a plant pathologist, but I understand that wetness produces more problems, generally produces more problems. So we're seeing more of that along with variability issues. If you look at the fall for Iowa, you see that Iowa kind of sticks out a little differently from the areas around it. It doesn't mean we're getting drier in the fall. We are still wet in the fall. If you go back to the early part of the 20th century, there were some wet years. So when you put a trend line with that, it looks like it's flat. We're as wet as everybody else is in the fall around this area. Just another graphic showing more about that spring precipitation. Yeah, Laura, you just caught that? Yep. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that we're getting drier in that area. It just means that there was a wetter period early in the trend line, so it's flattened out the trend line. Otherwise, why was that there?
Yeah.
I've looked at Iowa. I haven't looked at the other states. This is talking about change from the beginning of the 20th century until now, and then creating a trend line. Basically, early part of the 20th century was somewhat wet in Iowa, so that flattened out the trend line.
But why?
Because it was wetter then. It was wetter during that period.
But why? Okay, I guess we're not.
I haven't looked as to why it was wet at that point. Okay, there is regional variability. She's asking questions. I won't criticize her for asking questions. So, okay. Here's a little bit more of a zoom in on that in the way of what's happening in the way of precipitation for Iowa, especially in the spring. Again, that same 1895 until the present, many more wet years and very few dry years in the springtime. So, okay, we talk a great deal about these issues because of wetness, because from a soil standpoint and dealing, that's something that people can kind of get their heads around. They can see some of the issues related to soils. So trying to encourage better soil management practices by reducing tillage, using more cover crops. People understand that's somewhat of a good thing to do for soils, but when you're dealing with increasing wetness during this time, that this gives them a better capability to be able to handle this over time. So we do focus on this when we talk about with people a lot. That's also, you know, the increasing rainfall also produces, you know, more splash potential. If there is a disease that is residing in the soil, more splash on that onto plants and being able to, again, increase that disease issue. Most of the plant pathologists obviously would understand these issues and talk about this specifically. Do we deal with drought? Yes, and drought does not go away. Drought is part of our climate. We've just been lucky enough that when we have fewer droughts, but when they do, they are kind of nasty, as we've seen this year across you know, Iowa being kind of the epicenter for drought, and the Midwest being the worst of it so far. So we can't get away from it completely. So let's jump. Okay, are there any questions about the more questions about the temperature and precipitation, and then we'll go on to some of the other issues here. See, the number was supposed to be 17 seconds. I'm supposed to wait 17 seconds for giving people a chance to react before moving on. So, okay. Yeah, nothing, Laura?
Oh, I have questions.
Okay, go ahead.
What causes that diagonal band?
What causes the diagonal band?
Yes, is it from the Great Lakes or what?
No, it's not the Great Lakes. Again, it's there is regional variability in temperature, especially in precipitation. So there was probably a regional wetness that occurred early part of the century. Sometimes there's some funky things in the analysis early part of the 20th century too, because our spatial coverage and precipitation measurement wasn't quite as good at that point either. So there could be something in the measurement that would be a little bit off too. Okay? Okay. Other questions? Comments or complaints? Okay. Let's talk about some of the other issues related to this and some of the impacts because of this. One of them is simply because of this and varietal changes, we're seeing changes in where we're able to grow our crops, which presents a whole different set of issues related to that. Being where I spent a lot of time in the Northern Plains, we've seen, you know, in the last 20 to 30 years, corn and beans moved heavily into that area, replacing small grains. That's done a lot of things in the way of soil management. It's done some things in the way of climate. It's impacted climate because of that. We can talk about that if you want to, but that's one of the issues. We're just growing corn and beans in a lot larger area than we used to. You know, even up into into southern Canada now is a corn growing area because of changes in varieties and changes in what we're seeing in the way of the climate. Okay. Let's get into a bit more of the other issues we talked about. Related to this, not only can we grow crops in other areas, we have insects that can manage being in these other areas also. Because of the warming winters, we get less winter die-off, or they can overwinter in further north areas than they would have before to be able to be reintroduced. You get earlier spring emergence, so they're acting like perennial crops. And they're also, so they're expanding northward, and then you get an increased number of generations per year. The picture here, for those I'm not familiar with, is the brown marmorated stink bug. It is something you will see in your house frequently, but it has expanded its range extensively. I mentioned our postdoc fellow had done some work on several a couple different insects, these and Japanese beetles, and Palmer amaranth, all of which have climate components to their expansion into our area. That we're seeing expansion of the brown marmorated stink bug into our region that are really causing problems, especially with some of the specialty crop growers. They particularly do a number on apples. This is some of the work she did looking at climate change scenarios. By 2100, the blue areas are optimal for BMSB, so it's pretty much over the eastern U.S. Currently. But if by 2100, actually, we're projected to be warm enough that it will be too warm for them, and their prime areas will be the Great Lakes states and on up into Canada. It's really kind of interesting, some of the work that she did related to that. Related to weeds, changes in climate also impact what's happening in the way of weeds. This is and not even in climate, but increased CO2 does fertilize weeds. And we have, there's a famous experiment by an ARS scientist named, well, he's no longer an ARS scientist, he left ARS for Columbia University, looking at Canada thistle, I believe this is what this is, under doubled CO2 conditions, and what herbicides would do to this under doubled CO2 conditions. So this presents a problem in that certain weeds can outcompete other beneficial plants. Poison ivy is more virulent under CO2 conditions. Kudzu in the south, if you've heard about kudzu in the south, apparently kudzu loves CO2 also. Kudzu is a scourge already, and it's projected to be even more of a problem related to this, which presents lots of weed management issues. Not all weeds are that competitive, but certain ones are more competitive and can be problematic, especially in years like we've seen a couple of last year, and somewhat in the Northern Plains. North Dakota particularly was very wet this year. If you have wet springs and you're not able to get your crop out in appropriate cases because of wet soils, weeds are able to get ahead of your weed control capability. And that presents other problems for control, for those trying to do weed control. And obviously diseases, I feel silly talking to plant pathologists about diseases, but climate change presents another, a bigger set of disease issues with, I mentioned, increasing wetness, more disease chances, more variability issues. I know that not all diseases react to wetness. Some of the variability issues where you have drought stress and then get wet later on and produce some disease issues in corn. But also related to this, not only additional rainfall, but we are wet. The atmosphere is wet more frequently. We have higher dew points. When you have these high minimum temperatures, these high overnight temperatures are somewhat being driven by lots more moisture in the atmosphere. If you have more moisture in the atmosphere, that reduces the ability for us to cool down at night, and that increases your dew formation time, and the dew lasts longer. So that's an ongoing issue that we continue to have. Here's an example of some plots related to that humidity, more moisture in the air. In the lower left-hand side is parts of Iowa with the max and minimum temperature graphs, similar ones that I showed before. But in the upper right-hand side, what is happening to dew points? This is for Des Moines. Dew point temperatures averaged over the summer. And you can see that the trend over time, this is from the 30s on, you don't have data as back as far as we do for temperature and precipitation, overall increasing dew points. Keeps the temperatures up at night, also allows for more dew formation. This also produces some other issues, with some of the spring issues we've talked about, some of the spring changes in when dormancy break occurs. We've been struggling with a great deal in the way of especially fruit trees and other grasses, and also some winter injury kinds of things related to this. I guess to dive into this a little bit more, I talked about this briefly. What we're seeing more of, the growing season is being longer, because our average last spring freeze is getting early, average first fall freeze is getting later. So it's giving us a longer time between those freeze dates, but that spring freeze is still quite variable. And what that's allowing us to happen, especially with warmer winters and warmer early springs, you're seeing earlier dormancy break on a frequent basis. This is really a problem for fruit trees. And the areas, kind of the Ohio Valley, they've been hurt by it worst. Michigan hasn't had as many problems with it yet, but they're concerned about this happening in those areas. Also getting some, with these warming winters, some chill hours for tree fruits, producing some issues related to that. And then again, getting back to these freeze issues, we've seen several times, 3 times in the last 13 years where we've had freeze events that have done severe damage. We would add 2019 onto that last year with some of the damage being done because of this. And that's a real problem for some of our specialty crop producers. Okay, also here, we just, kind of that variability issues. And I mentioned also that a bunch of this information comes from the National Climate Assessment. If you'd like to find out more about basic understanding of how we know what we know, that's the Climate Science Report, which is this right here. A number of these images are from it, and there's also some explanation going along with it. Then there also are chapters in the next and part of this that talk about these things in more detail. There are regional chapters, so we were covered in the Midwest regional chapter. Agriculture had 2. We talked about rainfall, we talked about dew point, those 2 changes. The next National Climate Assessment is gearing up at this point, so we don't know what's going to go into that or not, but it's still part of that. Then there are also other special interest chapters, one on water, ag and rural communities, land cover and use. So if you want to, there's a national agriculture one, but then it becomes very diffuse across the whole country. We really have had some serious discussions about doing some of these that are more specific for agriculture, say in the Midwest region, comparatively, so you could cover on some of those details. Okay, are there any other questions at this point or other comments you have? Or complaints or other things you'd like to know about? Poison ivy more of a problem with increased heat because it grows more, produces more of the toxic oils. I believe it's more of the toxic oils that it is with the carbon dioxide, the additional carbon dioxide. I believe that's what it is. Okay, I'll slide on here through our last section and just some additional information for some things about us if you're interested. We also do some work again on decision making because it's helpful sometimes to understand when people are making decisions to see if we can provide information to support them. There was a project called Useful to Usable that was started about 10 years ago and created the first one of these. This is a decision vortex, we called it, on corn, when corn producers are making certain decisions, trying to help understand when they're making the decisions and can weather and climate information support those decisions. Like, for example, they're making seed corn decisions the previous fall. We really can't tell them too much about the following year at that point, so we can't help them out that way, but there are some other shorter term decisions that we can help them with. We're also working on these on drought with some more specialty crop producers. We worked on them with the National Drought Mitigation Center, where we talked about impacts of drought on some of the specialty crops when drought impacts them. So we're continuing this work, and it's I think it's going to be expanding through some other regions across the area. Okay, we talked about that. Another thing that we try to do is also try to provide some additional current information. Obviously, we need to understand some of the longer term changes and how to adapt. We'll talk about adaptation here in just a second. But sometimes avoiding bigger risks is by letting people know, producers know what's coming ahead of time to mitigate some of their decision making. So we do a monthly webinar with partners that talks about current and projected issues that anyone can get on. They can ask questions and find out about. We talk, it's led by NOAA, but we are a strong partner related to that, and usually have state climatologists presenting as part of it. From an adaptation standpoint, we are starting to ramp up our work on adaptation. Our partners at the Northern Forest Hub had developed an adaptation resources for forestry that they had done over a long period of time, and they've developed a version of this to connect with agriculture. So we're starting to ramp up with this and work with some partners, because that's the next step in all this. We know that things are changing. We're starting to understand what's changing because of them. So the next things are, what do we need to be doing to deal with these changes and make adaptations to those changes? And that's an ongoing process. There are adaptations that people are doing already. Things like drainage tile increases are adapting to the increased precipitation. So that's one adaptation. But we want to try to be thoughtful and help people develop more adaptation capabilities as we go along. Here's our website if you want to find out more about us, where we share much of our information. Again, since I'm flying solo, we haven't updated quite as much recently. We're hoping to be able to do that fairly soon here. We do create some outlooks, climate outlooks, that take the NOAA's climate outlooks and make use of that for agriculture. We update those and put those on our website. We also have a newsletter and some of our other information also connected here. And if you want to talk about us anymore, well, I'm the only one to talk to right now. Hopefully we'll have some additional people soon to be able to share that information with. So thanks for having me. What other complaints or questions do you have? Other thoughts?
Dennis, I have a question. So you mentioned that Iowa is getting wetter, but at the same time, there's some concerns about drought. So when you think of adaptation and like current research going on with breeding, I hear a lot about breeding for drought resistance, not so much for flood resistance. I don't know if that's even possible, but how can we prepare for, we're gonna think about adaptation to a wetter climate, and yet some years that we don't know which will be, it'll be a drought year.
And see, that's part of our problem, is that we can have both of those in the same year because of this high variability. Or even if you are getting a little bit wetter, if you do warm up, that increases your ET. And then even if you're getting a decent amount of precipitation, you may be outstripping your soil moisture because of high ET. And that's a real struggle, because if you have your variability is wider and you still focus on averages, we're going to go for average, there's much larger potential for being able to still be wrong because of this wider variability. So probably the biggest one I take from Jerry Hatfield, and I agree with this, is making sure you protect your soils. Because if you protect your soils and the water holding capacity of soils, then you have a capability of getting through those longer dry periods. How do we get through wet and dry? That's going to take some more thought and more serious thinking about how do we develop plants that are more resilient to that? How do we develop management systems that are more resilient to that? And that's where we need to partner with other folks, especially on the research end, to think through this and how we do that. I'd like to say I had all the answers, but I don't. Are there other questions? While you're thinking about those or wanting to interact, this is also a plea to reach out to us with ideas. If you have ideas about things that you would like to do, we are happy to try to partner with you. If you have newer information, we would like to be able, okay, I'll steal it. We want to steal it. We're happy to share it with people because we want to share new information with people when we're out talking with folks. We're also working on a couple other new products, one of which is a state-by-state. Basically, it's what we know about climate change and agriculture on a state-by-state basis. We're working on Illinois right now. We'll work across our 8-state region. But we'd also like to work on these. What does climate change mean for diseases? What does climate change mean for this crop or specific types of diseases? We would love to work with you on that to be able to create not an extensive publication, but maybe a 2 or 4 page thing that hits the high points for stakeholders and users to be able to do that sort of thing. Is there anything else? The other thing is also if you're applying to NIFA or something like that, I think NIFA may be bringing back the idea in its grants of saying how you are interacting with the Midwest Climate Hub, or how are you interacting with the climate hubs. Even if not, we'd like to know what you're doing. If we can serve on an advisory group or something like that, that way we know what you're doing and we can help try to share that information with others around the region.
We have a couple more minutes with Dennis, so if you have a burning question, this is your chance.
So this is Gwen. I have a question about a prediction of the crop species changes that might occur in the next like 20 or 30 years. As we have a longer growing season, it seems likely that we'll have a shift in the types of crop species. So do you guys have kind of a various possible scenarios of the crops that we're going to be running through? Because it seems like we could almost get a new crop and then it's going to move northward and we're going to have to get another one.
In the way of you know, of cash crops or other types of
All crops. I mean, the crops that we choose to grow to make money. So I guess that's cash crops, right?
Okay. From a cash crop standpoint, unfortunately, there are other issues besides climate that drive those.
Right.
You know, there's crop insurance and the generalized knowledge around growing corn and soybeans that really drive a lot of that decision making. So that may not change as quickly as it probably should. But there, and I did have I did have a producer at a talk in Southern Iowa said that. He said, okay, I understand things are changing. I understand it's going to be harder to grow corn and beans. Okay, what are we going to grow? And we don't have that answer. And we need to come up with an answer for something like that, because there are other things that we can grow readily. You know, grasses, we can grow grasses out around here, but is that what we want to be growing? So we need to sit down and have, you know, more serious conversations with people and have, I can't say this, but have some more serious considerations with people at higher levels about how we do this, so that we're not trying to continue to grow corn and beans in a changing situation where it's much harder to grow them, when we can grow something else more readily.
It seems like if we don't have some more forward looking, we're going to be constantly behind the curve.
We're behind the curve already.
Yeah, further behind the curve.
Yeah. I didn't show that graphic, but there's some work that Jerry Hatfield did that shows that we are increasing our losses, that our lack of potential is increasing. How do I put that? Basically, our potential crop yield is increasing linearly. We're frequently falling short on that because of climate issues. And we're overcoming some of those climate issues by higher inputs. So it kind of masks some of those areas. Speaking of which, I also forgot to mention that too. I should include that slide. USDA, I was on a group in USDA that Gene Tockley, may have known him, was also involved in this. we've created a climate change indicators for agriculture. It's 20 climate change indicators for ag, just talking about some different things that are changing on the climate side, but also on the plant, disease, et cetera side that are indicators of a changing climate. I can share that. I should have included that. I can share that with you if you're interested in finding more about it. Or if you just Google USDA climate change indicators, it should show up. It's a really kind of a neat thing and written in a way that can be used on for a wider audience, stakeholders, students, whatever. It points to research, but it is really well done.
Is that on your website?
God, I'm trying to remember if I linked it to I think it is. If not, I'll send it to you. Okay.
Any other
Well, if there's
questions?
nothing-
Go ahead, Dennis.
I say if there's ever a time anybody wants to reach out with other questions or talk to a class or something like that, I'm more than happy to do that as time allows.
All right. Well, Dennis, thanks for your time. I think we all learned a lot, and hopefully you'll be hearing from some of us soon. So thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Allison was clapping.
Yeah, Allison,
I got an applause. I know. You don't get to do the applause thing, right? Bummer.
That's okay. That's okay. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Dennis. Appreciate it. It's
Bye-bye.
bye.